I couldn't believe what I just heard. Here I was, dressed to the nines and sitting in the middle of a packed Chamber of Commerce event, moments away from accepting a prestigious award, when Janet, my wife of 10 years, leaned in and dropped a bombshell. Quietly, but with no hesitation, she told me she was heading to Vegas right after the ceremony. And not alone, she'd be going with Dennis, my business partner. Are you out of your mind? I whispered, barely able to keep the shock out of my voice. I glanced around, making sure no one else could hear us. Lust, Zachary. That's all this is. Pure, unapologetic lust, she said, her voice cool and composed. Right now, I can feel him hard through his pants, and soon enough, I'll feel him in every way I want. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to stay calm. We're going to have a conversation, I said, keeping my tone steady. But not here. After this event, when we're back home. Janet looked me dead in the eye, her expression almost amused. No, Zachary. Let me make something perfectly clear. If you want to talk, you'd better come up with a list of fantasies you've been holding back on. Maybe then we can discuss those. I'll be back Monday night, and we can chat, if you still care by then. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I knew her schedule well enough to realize she didn't need to be back at work until Tuesday. You've planned all of this out, haven't you? I asked, my voice a strained whisper. Of course, she said smoothly, like she was stating the weather. His wife knows, too. I shifted my gaze toward Dennis, sitting right beside her with that insufferable grin plastered on his face. The sheer arrogance of it made my blood boil. But I wasn't about to cause a scene here, not with half the town's business leaders watching. Instead, I glanced at Lisa, his wife, seated next to him. She looked miserable, her face pale, her lips tight. It was clear she was just as aware of this whole twisted situation as I was. My head was spinning, but the sound of my name being called snapped me out of it. The master of ceremonies gestured for me to come forward. I rose from my chair, walked to the stage, and shook his hand, forcing a smile for the cameras as I accepted the award. The speech I'd prepared had included a heartfelt thank you to Janet, but as I stood there, I made a decision. I cut that part out entirely. Instead, I kept my remarks short and focused on the community, expressing my gratitude to the chamber for the honor. I wrapped up quickly and headed back to my seat. Janet noticed the omission. No mention of me. Really? She said, her voice dripping with sarcasm as I sat down and reached for my now lukewarm drink. I didn't bother responding. I just looked at her, long enough to let her know exactly how I felt, then turned my attention elsewhere. Oh, that's how it's going to be, she muttered, giving me a smug little smirk. Fine. Like I said, we'll talk on Monday. Dennis was next to take the podium. As he passed by, he brushed against me intentionally. I used the moment to lean toward Janet. If you go through with this, don't bother coming home, I said quietly. There won't be anything left for you. To drive the point home, I slipped off my wedding ring and placed it in her hand. Janet didn't even flinch. She smirked, opened her purse, and dropped the ring inside like it was nothing more than loose change. You know why I'm doing this, right? She asked, her voice low and confident. Because of what you did with Lisa. Don't even try to deny it, I've got the pictures. So keep your mouth shut, let me have this weekend, and we'll talk when I get back. Janet, nothing happened between Lisa and me, I pleaded, trying to keep my voice steady. It was just dinner. We can work through this, but not like this. Her expression didn't budge. It's too late, Zachary. The plans are already in motion. The tickets are bought, the hotel is booked. This weekend, I'm giving Dennis my body, no strings attached. He can do whatever he wants, and there's nothing you can say or do to stop me. What if I told you he's HIV positive? I blurted out, desperate for anything to make her reconsider. She actually laughed at that. Nice try. You'd say anything to keep me from going, but I don't believe you for a second. Don't say I didn't warn you, I said, my voice hardening. If you go through with this, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. Relax, she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. Go play golf or something. When I get back, everything will go back to normal. Normal? There was no universe in which things could ever be normal again. No, Janet, I said, my voice calm but firm. Things will never be the same. She smirked again. We'll see about that. Moments later, Dennis returned to his seat, and Janet immediately turned to him, placing her hand back on his lap. Watching her so openly disregard me like that made my stomach turn. I looked away, forcing myself to keep my anger in check. Finally, the event wrapped up, and we all stood to leave. This is your last chance, Janet, I said, one final attempt to reach her. She and Dennis exchanged knowing glances before she turned back to me, smirking. We're heading out now, Zachary. Maybe I'll call you. Maybe I won't. Either way, I'll see you Monday. No hard feelings, buddy, Dennis added, his grin as infuriating as ever. I'll try not to wear her out too much for you. I kept my voice level. We're done, Dennis. Not just as business partners, but as friends too. Don't contact me again. Dennis laughed. We'll see about that, partner, he said, leading Janet away. I turned to Lisa, who was still seated, silent tears streaming down her face. Do you need a ride home? I asked softly. She shook her head. No, I called an Uber, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But thanks. Did you tell her? I asked gently. That nothing happened between us? That it was just dinner? I tried, she whispered, her voice cracking. She told me it was just dinner, Lisa said quietly, wiping the tears from her eyes. But Janet didn't believe me. Dennis has got photos of us at the restaurant, and now she's convinced it was the beginning of an affair. You know how she is when she makes up her mind. Oh, trust me, I know, I said with a bitter shake of my head. Once Janet latched onto an idea, there was no getting her to see reason. Jumping to conclusions and building stories out of thin air. That was her trademark move. I'm so sorry, Zachary, Lisa said softly, her voice trembling with guilt. You don't deserve this. I just hope Dennis has enough decency to at least use protection. It doesn't matter, I replied, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. Condom or no condom, it doesn't change the fact that she's giving herself to him. That's the part one can't stomach. I'm done, with both of them. What are you going to do? She asked, her concern clear in her voice. I'll do what I have to, I said simply. What about you? I told Dennis if he went through with this, I'd file for divorce, she said with newfound steel in her voice. And I meant it. This isn't the first time he's cheated, but it damn sure will be the last. Good for you, I said, nodding. If you need anything, let me know. I can put you in touch with a great lawyer if you're interested. Thanks, Zachary, she said, her voice softer now. I really appreciate it. With that, Lisa turned and walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts. After a moment, I headed to my car, my mind a whirlwind as I drove home. My thoughts kept circling back to the last 10 years of my life with Janet. We'd been married for a decade, but I first met her 4 years into my partnership with Dennis. He was the one who introduced us. At that point, Dennis and Lisa had been married for 3 years, and everything seemed perfect, or so I thought. Janet and I hit it off immediately. We started dating, and not long after, we got married. Dennis had even been my best man. Back then, I never would have imagined he'd betray me like this. And Janet? I didn't think she was capable of this kind of betrayal either. When we tied the knot, the business was just starting to take off. My lawyer, Joe Lee, had strongly advised me to get a prenuptial agreement to protect my assets, the house, the business, everything I'd worked so hard for. Janet wasn't thrilled about it, but eventually, she agreed to sign. I made sure the terms were fair and even included a clause about infidelity. I never thought I'd have to use it, but now, that clause was about to become my lifeline. When I got home, it was still early, so I decided to call Joe. He answered on the second ring. "Hey, Zachary," he greeted warmly. "I figured you'd be out celebrating your award with Janet tonight. What's up?" I wasted no time explaining everything that had gone down. When I finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Wow, Zachary. That's a lot to process," Joe finally said, his voice filled with sympathy. "I'm really sorry you're going through this. Do you want me to start drafting the divorce papers?" "Yes," I said, my voice resolute. "File based on adultery. It's all spelled out in the prenup. And there's more, I need you to start the process of dissolving the partnership with Dennis." Joe hesitated for a moment. "You're referring to the morality clause in your business agreement, right?" "Exactly," I confirmed. "What Dennis has done falls under that clause. I want the partnership dissolved, and I want to restructure the business. I've been thinking about converting it to an LLC, and now seems like the perfect time." "Got it," Joe said. "I'll start pulling everything together, but this will take some time." "I understand," I said. "But I need the partnership dissolved as soon as possible. And I want to minimize my financial losses." "Consider it done, Zachary," he assured me. "Thanks, Joe," I said, ending the call. I knew I'd have to buy Dennis out of the business, and while that thought stung, I trusted Joe to make sure I'd pay him as little as possible. A few hours later, my phone rang. The screen lit up with Janet's name. I took a deep breath before answering. "We just got to the hotel in Vegas," she said casually, her tone light and breezy. "I'm so ready for a weekend of non-stop fun." "Janet," I said, my voice steady, "before you do anything, there's something you need to know. Dennis is HIV positive. If you go through with this, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. Come home now, and maybe, just maybe, we can fix this." She laughed, a cold, dismissive sound. "Oh, Zachary, still trying to scare me? Please. Get over yourself." "Janet, I'm warning you," I started, but she hung up before I could finish. That was the last straw. I tried to warn her, but she didn't care. My weekend, already ruined, was spent erasing Janet from my life. First thing Saturday morning, I followed Joe's advice and headed to the bank. I paid off Janet's credit card balance and canceled it immediately. Every step felt like another piece of her grip on my life being severed. Throughout the weekend, she left me 3 voicemails and sent several text messages, each one filled with taunts and attempts to provoke me. I ignored them all. I was done playing her game. "Oh, Zachary," Janet purred in one of her voicemails. "Dennis is inside me right now. God, it's so much bigger than yours, and it feels absolutely incredible. I've already swallowed him a few times, something I never did for you, but he's just too delicious to resist. Who knows? Maybe I'll even let him knock me up. Anyway, gotta go, he's ready for another round. Bye." Her other voicemails were just as explicit, laced with venom. I didn't hesitate to forward them all to Joe as evidence of her infidelity. I sent copies to Lisa, too, knowing they would strengthen her case against Dennis in her divorce. After that, I called a locksmith. By the end of the day, the locks on every door were changed. The house wasn't an issue, it was mine, bought long before I married Janet, with the mortgage solely in my name. Once the locks were secure, I went to work packing up all of her clothes and personal items. I shoved them into garbage bags, leaving enough room in her car for her to drive. I moved the car out of the garage and parked it in the driveway, leaving it there like a symbol of her exile. Next, I began purging her presence from the house. Every photo that included her came down, even the oversized wedding portrait that had hung above the fireplace. That one. I smashed it to pieces and tossed the remains into the fireplace, watching the flames consume what little was left of our union. By the time I was done, it was as if Janet had never been a part of my life. The following morning, after hearing yet another vulgar voicemail, I decided it was time to call Janet's mother. "We need to talk," I told her. She invited me over for lunch, and I didn't hesitate to accept. After we ate, she looked at me with a worried expression. "What's going on, Zachary?" I didn't hold back. I told her everything, and when I played Janet's voicemails, her face crumbled. By the time I finished, she was in tears, shaking her head in disbelief. "That foolish girl," she muttered. "I can't believe she would do this to you. Zachary, I'm so sorry. Of course, she can stay here if she needs to, but I promise you, I'm going to let her have it for this." "I'm sorry too, Mom," I said, the words heavy. Since my own mother passed away a few years ago, Janet's mom had taken on that role for me. "She's going to need all the support she can get. Don't you worry," she said firmly. "But that doesn't mean I won't give her a piece of my mind." I chuckled softly, pulling her into a hug. As we pulled apart, she wiped her eyes. "Please stay in touch, Zachary," she said. "I will," I promised as I left. She was still dabbing at her tears as I walked out the door. After leaving her house, I stopped at a local tavern famous for its burgers. I ordered one and treated myself to a couple of beers. It wasn't much, but after the weekend I'd endured, I needed a moment of comfort. By Monday, Joe called with an update. "Everything's ready," he told me. I went to his office, where I reviewed the documents. The divorce papers and business dissolution paperwork were immaculate, exactly what I needed. I signed everything, paid his retainer, and left knowing the court filings would begin the next day. "Where do you want her served?" Joe asked as I was leaving. "At her workplace," I said without hesitation. "She embarrassed me publicly, it's only fair she gets a taste of the same." Joe nodded. "Consider it done." Later that day, I received another voicemail from Janet. This time, she informed me she was on her way home. I couldn't help but laugh at the audacity. Gerald, Dennis, as he insisted on being called professionally, dropped her off around 5:30 in the evening. He sped away as though he couldn't get away fast enough, no doubt too cowardly to face me. I waited in the living room, listening as she stepped onto the porch and fumbled with her keys. After a few moments, I heard the doorbell ring. I ignored it at first, but then the pounding on the door began. "Let me in," she shouted. I stood up, walked to the door, and opened it. Janet stared at me, confusion and irritation etched on her face. She tried to step inside, but I blocked her. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her voice incredulous. "I live here too." "You knew," I interrupted. "And you didn't care." Janet didn't know what she was walking into. That, in my eyes, violates every term of our partnership. I was willing to offer you a severance package, maybe even keep you on as a silent partner so you'd have access to benefits. But after this weekend? Forget it. Dennis's face turned red with anger. "You can't do this. I'll fight you on this. I'll ruin your reputation. I'll tell everyone you've been sleeping with the female staff and threatening their jobs if they don't go along with it." I smiled faintly and pulled out a small audio recorder, pressing play. Our conversation echoed through the room, including his threats. "I think this recording will make your threats crystal clear in court," I said, my voice steady. "Not to mention, you made them in front of 2 witnesses." I gestured toward the 2 security guards, who nodded silently in confirmation. Dennis stared at the recorder, then at the guards. For a moment, it looked like he might try to argue, but he slumped in defeat. "You've got 10 minutes, I said, glancing at my watch. "Pack your things and leave." I turned to the guards. Watch him closely. Make sure he doesn't touch his computer and only takes what belongs to him. Yes, Mr. Hill, one of the guards replied. Under their watchful eyes, Dennis packed up his belongings. Before leaving, he stopped at my office one last time. "I'm sorry, Zachary," he said, his voice barely audible. I didn't even look up. "Just leave." Once Dennis was gone, I called a company-wide meeting. We squeezed into the main office, and I explained that Dennis was no longer with the company and that the partnership had been dissolved. I reassured the team that their jobs were secure, despite any short-term disruptions. One employee hesitantly raised their hand. "Why did he leave?" they asked. "It's a personal matter," I replied curtly. "Let's focus on moving forward." The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Janet was served with divorce papers at her workplace on Thursday, which set off a wave of gossip. Her mother later told me she'd seen Dr. Barnes on Tuesday, but the results would take time. For once, Janet didn't flood me with calls or texts. It seemed she finally grasped the weight of her actions. Realizing there was no chance of reconciliation, she signed the divorce papers. Joe informed me the divorce would be finalized in 90 days. Meanwhile, Mary filed for divorce from Dennis. She told me he was living in a rundown motel, scraping by week to week. But his troubles didn't stop there. After Janet's appointment with Dr. Barnes, the doctor reported Dennis to the authorities. In our state, failing to disclose an HIV-positive status before engaging in sexual activity is a serious crime. Janet testified that Dennis hadn't told her, and he now faced up to 20 years in prison. Although the law isn't always enforced, the prosecutor decided to pursue the case, citing the public health risk. A week after being evicted from his home, Dennis was arrested at the motel. Given the potential danger he posed, he was placed in solitary confinement until his trial. Dennis's trial became a media spectacle. The prosecution painted him as a selfish, manipulative individual who had knowingly endangered others. Both Janet and I testified, as did Mary. The prosecutor even played the audio recording I'd made during our office confrontation, which only further sealed Dennis's fate. It didn't take long for the jury to convict him. The judge, clearly disgusted by Dennis's actions, handed down the maximum sentence, 20 years in state prison. Even then, Dennis's troubles weren't over. Alongside his criminal conviction, he now faced civil lawsuits from both Mary and me. His reputation was shattered, his career obliterated, and his future left in ruins. For me, life moved forward. The betrayal had cut deep, but with each passing day, the wounds began to heal. I focused on rebuilding, not just my business, but my sense of self. What Dennis and Janet had done was unforgivable, but they no longer had power over me. It was time to leave the past behind and look ahead to a better future. After Mary's divorce was finalized, she sold their house and moved out of the area. A few days before my own divorce was finalized, I got a message from Janet asking if I'd meet her for dinner. At first, I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but another part thought maybe it was time to put everything to rest. After some deliberation, I agreed. We met at a quiet little restaurant, Neutral Ground, a place neither of us had been before. Janet looked nervous as I walked in. She offered me a hesitant smile as I sat down. "I hope you're not too embarrassed to be seen with me," she said, her voice tentative. I leaned back, giving her a measured look. "As long as this dinner doesn't involve sharing bodily fluids, I think we'll be fine," I replied, my tone dry but not unkind. She let out a small laugh, though it sounded forced. "I got my test results," she said after a moment of silence. "I'm positive." I had expected it, but the confirmation still landed like a punch to the gut. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said softly. She shook her head. "It's not your fault. You tried to warn me, but I didn't listen. Now I'll be paying for that mistake for the rest of my life." "What's the doctor doing for you?" I asked. He put me on antiretroviral therapy, she said, her voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. There's no cure, but he says as long as I stick to the medication, I can live a relatively normal life. I had to tell my boss, though. Thankfully, he's letting me work from home. And Mom said I can stay with her for as long as I need. That's good, I said, and I meant it. Whatever had happened between us, I didn't wish for her life to fall apart completely. My lawyer's suing Dennis, she added. With his conviction, they say it's almost a sure thing. But collecting might be a different story since he's in prison. I nodded. Well, his 401k should still have some money in it, even after Mary took her share. Plus, there's whatever's left from the sale of their house. That might help. Have you talked to Mary lately? She asked. Not recently, I said. But she's keeping busy. She moved out of state and seems to be doing okay. I'll let her know what you said. She might have some advice. We fell into an uneasy silence for a moment before I finally spoke. I have to ask, Janet. What happened? I don't understand. We had a good life, or at least, I thought we did. I wanted a future with you. Kids, the works. She looked down at her hands, fidgeting with the edge of her napkin. I don't know, Zachary, she said quietly. When Dennis showed me those pictures of you and Mary, I just snapped. I was so sure you were cheating on me. I didn't stop to think. I didn't want to. Why didn't you just talk to me? I asked, my voice calm but firm. I was angry, she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. And hurt. I didn't want to hear your explanations. Even when Mary tried to warn me, I thought she was just covering for you. I convinced myself I was right. I tried to tell you about Dennis, I said. I tried twice. I know, she whispered. I didn't want to listen. And now I'm stuck paying the price for the rest of my life. I'll regret it forever. Can you forgive me for being so stupid? I sighed, running a hand through my hair. I don't know, I said honestly. Right now, I'm just trying to stay civil. I appreciate that, she said, her voice trembling. I know I don't deserve it. How are you holding up, Zachary? I'm managing, I said. The business keeps me busy. With Dennis gone, I've had to take on a lot more responsibility, so there's no shortage of work. She hesitated. Are you seeing anyone? I shook my head. No. And I'm not looking, either. It's going to take a long time for me to even think about trusting someone again. She nodded, biting her lip. I understand. I'm sorry for everything. I leaned forward slightly. You know what this has taught me, Janet? Never trust anyone. I thought he was my best friend, someone I could rely on. Turns out, I didn't know him at all. And then what you did? That didn't help. Her eyes filled with tears. I know, she said softly. I don't blame you for feeling that way. My eyes drifted down to her hand. I see you're still wearing your rings, I said. She glanced at them and gave a small, sad smile. We're technically still married, she said. At least for a few more days. If you want them back, you can have them. But I was hoping you'd let me keep them. I don't want them, I said, shaking my head. I'd just sell them anyway. Why do you want to keep them? Her voice broke as she answered, as a reminder. Of what I had, and what I threw away. They're yours, I said, standing up. Do whatever you want with them. Thank you, she whispered, a single tear sliding down her cheek. I nodded, signaling to the waiter for the check. This was the last chapter of a story I never thought I'd live through, but it was finally over. I walked out of the restaurant and didn't look back. I better get going, I said, standing and sliding my chair back. Still got a lot to do tonight. Tell your mom I said hello, and good luck with everything. I will, Janet said softly. And, thanks, Zachary. For everything. I really am sorry. Yeah, I said, nodding as I pushed my hands into my pockets. Me too, Janet. Goodbye. Her soft sobs followed me as I walked away. I didn't look back, but the sound stayed with me, heavy and raw. I wasn't as angry as I had been at the start of this whole ordeal, but that didn't make the weight any lighter. Ending a decade-long relationship with someone you thought would be your forever. That's not something you just move on from. It leaves scars, even if the wound eventually heals. Life went on, though, as life tends to do. Work became my anchor, and before long, the rhythm of it all settled into a steady routine. I buried myself in my job, avoiding anything that might disrupt the fragile stability I'd built. Within a year, things felt manageable again, even if they were far from ideal. I had opportunities to date, more than a few, in fact, but I wasn't ready. Not after what Janet and Dennis put me through. Instead, my life turned into a repetitive cycle: work, eat, sleep, and repeat. Social life? Non-existent. About a year and a half after my divorce, something shifted. My secretary, Denise, introduced me to her younger sister, Betty, at a company event. Betty was a couple of years younger than me and had her own baggage to carry. Her husband had left her for another woman. At first, we were hesitant, both of us wary of jumping into anything serious. But we started talking. Slowly, cautiously, we began to open up. We took things one step at a time. There were walls, mine and hers, but as the weeks turned into months, those walls started to come down. Betty understood what it felt like to have trust shattered into pieces, and that understanding brought us closer. Eventually, things progressed. The first night she stayed at my place felt like a milestone, a step into a new chapter one wasn't sure I'd ever be ready for. But with Betty, it felt right. It felt safe. A few months later, I asked her to marry me. I'll never forget the way her eyes lit up when she said yes. We've been planning a spring wedding ever since, followed by a 5-day Caribbean cruise. It feels surreal, but it also feels like the kind of life I'd almost given up on. We even invited Janet's mom to the wedding. She was as much a victim of all this as I was, and though we're not sure if she'll come, the invitation felt like the right thing to do. I'm not going to lie, there are days when the pain of what Janet and Dennis did still sneaks up on me. But Betty has been a light in the darkness, helping me heal in ways I didn't think were possible. I've done my best to be the same for her. We've both been through hell, but we've built something strong from the ashes. When I think about Betty, there's an old saying that always comes to mind: sometimes, the worst things that happen to us lead us to the best things we'll ever experience. For the first time in years, I can honestly say I'm looking forward to the future. And with Betty by my side, I know it's going to be one worth living. Subscribe and stay one step ahead of cheaters. And trust me, the next story makes this one look like a fairy tale.